On the evening of October 14th, 1943, in the small Belgian town of Namur, Sister Marie-Thérèse Beaumont stood in the dim kitchen of the Convent of the Sacred Heart, methodically grinding dried herbs with a mortar and pestle. The autumn rain drummed against the stone walls, while 200 German soldiers billeted in the converted monastery next door, prepared for their evening meal, laughing and talking in voices that carried through the thin walls. They had no reason to suspect that the quiet woman in the black habit, whose dark skin made her a curiosity even among her fellow sisters, would become the instrument of their complete undoing. They believed themselves safe, fed and far from the front lines, enjoying what they considered a peaceful occupation, posting in a cooperative town. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these soldiers could not have imagined was that within 12 hours, their assumptions about safety, about occupied territories, and about the harmless nature of religious women would be shattered by a carefully orchestrated act of resistance that would send shockwaves through the German military command and become one of the most controversial operations of the Belgian resistance. Sister Marie-Thérèse was not Belgian by birth. She had been born Marie-Thérèse Nkomo in the Belgian Congo in 1908, the daughter of a Congolese mother and a Belgian colonial administrator who had acknowledged her but never legitimized her birth. Her mixed heritage made her an outsider in both worlds, neither fully accepted by the European community nor entirely part of the African villages her mother came from. The Catholic Church had become her sanctuary at age 12, when the Sisters of Charity had taken her into their mission school in Leopoldville. There she discovered a vocation that transcended the racial barriers that defined colonial society. By 1932, at age 24, she had taken her final vows and been assigned to work in the mission hospital, where her natural aptitude for medicine and her gentle manner with patients made her invaluable to the overworked medical staff. Her journey to Belgium had come in 1938, when Mother Superior Marguerite had requested her transfer to assist with establishing a new medical training program at the Convent of the Sacred Heart in Namur. The older nun had recognized in Marie-Thérèse not just medical skill, but a fierce intelligence and a determination that came from a lifetime of proving herself in spaces that did not want to accept her. The move had been difficult. Belgium in the late 1930s was not prepared for a black nun, even one with impeccable credentials and fluent French. She endured stares, whispers, and occasional outright hostility, but she had learned long ago to transform such treatment into fuel for her resolve rather than allowing it to diminish her. When the German forces invaded Belgium in May of 1940, sweeping through the country with terrifying speed, the Sisters of the Sacred Heart had debated what to do. Some argued for fleeing to France or even attempting to return to the Congo. Others insisted they must stay and serve their community regardless of who occupied it. Sister Marie-Thérèse had been among those who voted to remain. She understood occupation in ways her European sisters did not. She had grown up under one form of it in the Congo, watching how power operated when one group believed themselves inherently superior to another. She recognized the patterns, the assumptions, the blindness that came with such certainty. The early years of occupation had been marked by a cautious coexistence. The German military command had initially left the convent largely alone, respecting the neutrality traditionally afforded to religious institutions. The sisters continued their work of education and medical care, though now they served a population living under strict military control, with rationing, curfews, and the constant presence of armed soldiers on every street corner. Sister Marie-Thérèse worked in the convent's small clinic, treating everything from children's fevers to injuries from factory accidents. She developed a reputation for her skill with medicinal herbs, having combined the traditional plant knowledge she had learned from her mother in the Congo with the formal pharmaceutical training she had received in mission hospitals. It was this reputation that first brought her into contact with the Belgian resistance. In the spring of 1942, a young man named Philippe Durand had arrived at the clinic late one evening with what he claimed was a farm injury. His hand was indeed badly cut, but Sister Marie-Thérèse noticed immediately that the wound was fresh and clean, not the ragged tear one would expect from agricultural equipment. She also noted the way he positioned himself to watch the door, the tension in his shoulders, and the small burn mark on his sleeve that suggested he had been near an explosion. She said nothing as she cleaned and stitched the wound, but when she handed him a small packet of herbs for infection, she included a note written in a code she had learned in the Congo, a simple substitution cipher based on Lingala words. The note read, "I understand. I can help. Return when safe." Felipe had returned 3 weeks later, this time openly. He explained that he was part of a network working to sabotage German supply lines and gather intelligence for the Allied forces. The resistance had been watching her for months, he admitted. They had noticed her movements around town, her interactions with both German soldiers and Belgian civilians, and most importantly, her access to medical supplies and her knowledge of pharmacology. They had a proposition. Would she be willing to use her skills to support their efforts? The risk was enormous. If caught, she would face immediate execution, and her status as a nun would provide no protection. Religious habit or not, the German military courts showed no mercy to those convicted of resistance activities. Sister Marie-Thérèse had asked for 3 days to pray and consider. She spent those days in the convent chapel, wrestling with the moral implications of what was being asked of her. Her vows had committed her to healing, to preserving life, to serving God through service to others. What Felipe was suggesting would require her to harm, possibly even to contribute to loss of life. Yet she also understood that occupation was its own form of violence, a slow strangling of a people's dignity and freedom. She thought of the families she treated in the clinic, the children growing up knowing only military rule, the young men disappeared in the night for questioning, the quiet desperation of a population living under constant surveillance and threat. On the 3rd day, she emerged from the chapel and sent word through a trusted contact that she would help. But she had conditions. She would gather intelligence, she would provide medical care to resistance fighters, and she would use her pharmaceutical knowledge for their purposes. However, she would not directly participate in violence, and any plans that required her involvement must be carefully considered and justified. She would not become a mere instrument of vengeance. Everything she did must serve a clear strategic purpose that would genuinely advance the liberation of Belgium and the defeat of the occupation forces. For 18 months, Sister Marie-Thérèse walked a delicate line between her public role as a nun and her secret work with the resistance. She passed information about German troop movements that she overheard in the clinic when soldiers came for treatment. She identified which officers were stationed at which locations by observing the insignia on uniforms and listening to casual conversations. She provided false medical certificates to resistance members who needed to avoid forced labor assignments. And she used her considerable knowledge of pharmacology to develop various substances the resistance needed. Sedatives that could be slipped into drinks, compounds that would make vehicles temporarily inoperable without causing obvious sabotage, even preparations that would cause convincing but temporary illnesses to help people avoid deportation or conscription. Her position as a black woman, as a nun, and as someone perceived by many Germans as exotic and therefore incomprehensible, gave her an unusual advantage. The soldiers stationed in Namur largely ignored her, seeing her as part of the background scenery of the town, no more threatening than the furniture. Those who did notice her often fell into one of 2 categories. They were either paternalistically friendly, treating her with a condescending kindness as if she were a child or a curiosity, or they were openly racist, making crude comments about her appearance and origins. In both cases, they drastically underestimated her intelligence and her resolve. She had learned long ago that being underestimated was a form of invisibility, and invisibility could be a powerful weapon when used strategically. The operation that would define her role in the resistance began to take shape in late September of 1943. Philippe and his cell had received intelligence from London that a major German counter-offensive was being planned for early November, aimed at disrupting Allied supply lines and reinforcing positions along the coast. The success of this operation depended heavily on the rapid movement of troops through Belgium to staging areas in northern France. One critical link in this chain was the reserve battalion stationed in and around Namur. approximately 800 soldiers, who would be mobilized as reinforcements once the operation began. If these troops could be prevented from reaching their deployment points, or if their deployment could be significantly delayed, it would create a gap in the German lines that Allied forces could potentially exploit. The resistance had considered various approaches. Direct military action was out of the question. They lacked the weapons, personnel, and element of surprise necessary to engage an entire battalion. Sabotaging transportation infrastructure was possible but difficult, and would likely result in civilian casualties when the Germans retaliated. What they needed was something that would incapacitate a large number of soldiers simultaneously, creating enough chaos and confusion to delay their deployment by several crucial days, while being difficult for the German command to immediately understand or respond to. It was Philippe's contact in the underground, a man who went by the code name Corbeau, who first suggested that medical intervention might be the answer. Sister Marie-Thérèse had been called to a meeting in the basement of a butcher shop on the edge of town. Present were Philippe, Corbeau, and 3 other resistance leaders she had not met before. Corbeau, a former chemistry professor from the University of Brussels, laid out the idea. The German battalion had recently requisitioned the monastery building adjacent to the convent to serve as temporary barracks for 200 soldiers who were part of a logistics and supply unit. These men were responsible for organizing and coordinating the movement of equipment, ammunition, and provisions. Disrupting their operations would have a cascading effect on the entire battalion's readiness. The monastery shared a kitchen facility with the convent, and the sisters had been pressed into service preparing meals for the soldiers 3 times daily. It was, Corbeau explained, an almost perfect opportunity for a large-scale incapacitation operation. The proposal was to introduce a carefully calculated dosage of toxic substances into the soldiers' evening meal. Not enough to be immediately fatal, but enough to cause severe gastrointestinal distress, dehydration, and temporary incapacitation that would require medical evacuation and hospitalization. The confusion and medical emergency of 200 soldiers simultaneously falling ill would overwhelm the local German medical facilities, tie up transportation and communication resources, and force the command to delay deployment plans while they investigated the cause and treated the affected men. By the time they recovered enough to deploy, the critical window for the counteroffensive would have passed. Sister Marie-Thérèse listened to the plan in silence, her face unreadable. When Corbeau finished, she asked a series of precise questions about the intended effects, the chemical compounds he was proposing, and the expected timeline of symptoms. She then asked about the other sisters in the convent. Would they be implicated? What protection could be offered to them? And what would happen to the civilian population of Namur when the Germans inevitably sought someone to blame? Corbeau admitted that there were no guarantees of safety, but the plan included creating evidence that would point toward a contaminated food shipment rather than deliberate poisoning, which might redirect German anger away from the local population and toward their own supply chain failures. The ethical weight of what was being proposed pressed down on Sister Marie-Thérèse like a physical force. 200 men made ill deliberately. Some might have complications, some might suffer permanent damage. A few might even perish if they had underlying health conditions or if medical care was delayed. These were not abstract numbers. They were individuals, many of them young men who had been conscripted into military service and who might personally bear no particular animosity toward Belgium or its people. Yet they were also part of a military machine that was crushing her adopted country, that had brought nothing but suffering and oppression, that represented a system built on the assertion that some lives mattered more than others, based on arbitrary classifications of race and nationality. She thought of the families in her clinic. She thought of the young Belgian men who had been shipped to labor camps in Germany. She thought of the Jewish families who had disappeared from Namur in the night, taken to destinations no one spoke about openly, but everyone knew were places of horror. She thought of her own experiences of being deemed lesser, of being judged and found wanting, based on the color of her skin rather than the content of her character or the capabilities of her mind. And she thought of the strategic calculation that this single night of carefully orchestrated illness might save countless lives if it successfully disrupted the German military operations being planned. After a long silence, she spoke. She would do it, but only if certain conditions were met. First, she must be the one to prepare the compounds. She would not trust this to anyone else, as the difference between incapacitation and fatality was a matter of precise dosages that required expert knowledge. Second, the other sisters must be protected. A plan must be in place to ensure that suspicion fell elsewhere and that the convent itself would not become a target for German reprisals. Third, she wanted assurance that this was not simply an act of vengeance, but a genuine strategic operation that had been coordinated with Allied intelligence and would serve a concrete military purpose. And finally, she would need to confess this to Mother Superior Marguerite. She would not deceive the woman who had believed in her and brought her to Belgium. If Mother Superior forbade it, she would not proceed. The resistance leaders agreed to all her conditions. Corbeau would provide her with the necessary chemical precursors, which could be obtained through various black market channels without arousing suspicion. Philippi would coordinate with London to confirm that the operation aligned with broader Allied strategic objectives, and they would all wait while she spoke with Mother Superior. Sister Marie-Thérèse left the meeting and walked slowly back through the dark streets to the convent, her mind churning through the implications of what she had agreed to consider. Mother Superior Marguerite was in her office when Sister Marie-Thérèse knocked on the door near midnight. The older woman looked up from the ledger she was reviewing by candlelight, her weathered face creasing with concern at the late visit. Sister Marie-Thérèse closed the door carefully behind her and sat down without being invited, which itself signaled the gravity of what she needed to discuss. For the next hour she laid out everything. Her work with the resistance over the past 18 months, the intelligence she had gathered and passed, the medical assistance she had provided to resistance fighters, and now this new proposal that would cross a line she had never crossed before. Mother Superior Marguerite listened without interrupting, her expression growing more troubled as the story unfolded. When Sister Marie-Thérèse finished, the older woman rose from her desk and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened courtyard. Her response, when it came, was not what Sister Marie-Thérèse had expected. Mother Superior did not forbid the operation. Instead, she spoke of her own experiences during the First World War, when she had been a young nun working in a field hospital near Ypres. She had seen what modern conflict did to human bodies and human souls. She had made decisions about who would receive morphine for pain when supplies were scarce, knowing that those she could not help would suffer terribly. She had helped hide young men who were deserting from both sides of that conflict, believing that their lives mattered more than their military obligations. War, she said quietly, forced impossible choices on people of conscience. The question was not whether one's hands would remain clean, they would not, but whether one's actions served justice and mercy or merely added to the sum of human suffering. She turned back to face Sister Marie-Thérèse and said that she could not give permission for such an operation, as it was not hers to give. But she would not stand in the way. She added one caveat. After this was done, Sister Marie-Thérèse must spend one full day in prayer and fasting, contemplating what she had done and seeking forgiveness and clarity. Not because Mother Superior believed the act was necessarily sinful, but because taking actions that harmed others, even in service of a greater good, left marks on the soul that must be acknowledged and processed. To do such things without acknowledging their weight was to risk becoming the very thing one fought against. With Mother Superior's counsel received, Sister Marie-Thérèse sent word through Philippe that she would proceed. The operation was scheduled for October 14th, chosen because intelligence indicated that the battalion would be receiving new deployment orders on October 16th, giving just enough time for the effects of the operation to create maximum disruption. Corbeau provided her with several small vials of concentrated compounds, along with detailed instructions on how to prepare and combine them. The substances were derived from common plants, castor beans, Jimson weed and certain mushroom varieties, but concentrated and refined to precise potencies. The plan was to create a mixture that would cause severe cramping, vomiting, diarrhea, dizziness and weakness, beginning approximately 2 to 4 hours after ingestion and lasting for 3 to 5 days. The dosage would be carefully calculated to affect adult men of average weight without causing permanent organ damage or respiratory failure. Sister Marie-Thérèse spent 3 days preparing the compounds in the small herb room off the convent kitchen, where she normally prepared medical tinctures and poultices. She worked only during times when the other sisters were occupied elsewhere, and she kept the door locked, claiming she was working on a complex preparation that required intense concentration. The process was exacting and required multiple stages of extraction, distillation, and concentration. She tested small amounts on herself first, taking doses barely perceptible to the tongue, just enough to verify that the preparation was working as intended and to understand what the soldiers would experience. The bitter taste of the concentrated mixture was strong, which meant it would need to be thoroughly masked by the flavors of the food it was added to. The German soldiers billeted in the monastery had a predictable routine. They rose at 6 o'clock each morning for exercises and inspection. Breakfast was served at 7 o'clock. They drilled and performed various administrative duties throughout the day. Lunch was at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Evening meal was served at 7 o'clock in the evening, and lights out was at 10 o'clock at night. The evening meal was the largest and most varied, typically consisting of bread, soup, a main course of meat or sausage with potatoes or cabbage, and sometimes a dessert of pudding or cake. It was also the meal during which the soldiers were most relaxed and least vigilant, having completed their duties for the day. Sister Marie-Thérèse volunteered to take the lead in preparing the evening meal on October 14th, claiming that she wanted to use some of the preserved vegetables from the convent garden before they spoiled. The other sisters were grateful for her initiative, as the work of feeding 200 soldiers, in addition to their normal convent duties, had become exhausting. She began preparations in the afternoon, working on a large batch of potato and leek soup that would be the first course, and a hearty stew of turnips, carrots, and barley that would be the main dish. The meat ration for the day was limited, so the stew was largely vegetable-based, which actually suited her purposes perfectly. As she worked, stirring the enormous pots over the kitchen fires, she prayed, not for success and not for forgiveness, but for clarity of purpose and steadiness of hand. She prayed for the souls of the men who would suffer from what she was about to do. She prayed for the people of Belgium and for an end to the conflict that had consumed the continent. And she prayed for the strength to carry the weight of this action for the rest of her life, knowing that it would never leave her, that she would never forget the deliberate choice she was making in this moment. At 6 o'clock in the evening, when the soup and stew were nearly ready, she sent the other sisters to begin setting up the long tables in the monastery refectory where the soldiers ate. Alone in the kitchen, she carefully removed the vials from their hiding place in her habit. Her hands were steady as she measured and added the compounds to the food, stirring them thoroughly to ensure even distribution. The amounts had been calculated with precision. Each soldier would consume approximately 3 bowls of soup and 2 servings of stew over the course of the meal. The total dosage would be sufficient to cause the intended effects without crossing into the territory of fatal poisoning. She tasted both preparations after adding the compounds, noting the slight bitterness that was mostly masked by the strong flavors of the vegetables and the salt she had liberally applied. The soldiers began filing into the refectory at 7 o'clock, their voices loud and cheerful as they took their seats at the long wooden tables. Sister Marie-Thérèse and 2 other nuns served the food, ladling soup into tin bowls and carrying large tureens of stew to each table. The soldiers barely glanced at the women serving them, focused instead on their conversations and their food. Sister Marie-Thérèse observed them as she worked, noting their youth. Many looked to be in their early 20s with the softness of young men not yet hardened by combat. They talked about letters from home, about football matches they had listened to on the radio, about their hopes for weekend leave. They were people full of the same petty concerns and simple joys as anyone else, and she was poisoning them. One soldier, a corporal named Friedrich Hartmann, did speak to her as she refilled his bowl. He had been treated in the clinic several weeks earlier for an infected tooth and had been surprised to be cared for by a black nun. He asked her, in halting French, how she was doing, if the work of feeding so many men was too difficult. She responded quietly that she was well and that service was part of her calling. He smiled and thanked her for the food, saying it was better than what they usually received from the military kitchens. She nodded and moved on, her face calm, but her heart pounding. In that moment, she nearly faltered, nearly considered abandoning the plan and disposing of the remaining contaminated food. But she thought of Philippe and the others in the resistance who were counting on her. She thought of the operation that this delay might prevent, of the lives that might be saved if these soldiers could not perform their logistics functions for the upcoming counter-offensive, and she continued serving. By 8 o'clock in the evening, all 200 soldiers had been fed. They lingered over their meals, enjoying the relative comfort of the warm refectory and the satisfaction of full stomachs. Sister Marie-Thérèse and the other nuns cleaned the serving dishes and began washing the enormous pots in the kitchen. She moved through these tasks mechanically, her mind already moving ahead to what would come next. The compounds would begin taking effect in approximately 2 to 4 hours. That meant the first symptoms would appear between 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock in the evening. By midnight, the situation should be apparent. By morning, it would be chaos. She retired to her small room in the convent at 9 o'clock, claiming exhaustion from the heavy work of cooking. She knelt by her narrow bed and began to pray the rosary, the familiar rhythm of the prayers providing a focus point for her racing thoughts. As she reached the third decade, she heard the first sounds of distress from the monastery building. Raised voices, urgent footsteps in the hallway, the sound of someone retching violently. Then more voices, more footsteps. Within 30 minutes, the monastery had erupted into complete disorder. Sister Marie-Thérèse continued praying, her fingers moving automatically from bead to bead, even as she listened to the growing chaos next door. At 10:30, there was a loud pounding on the convent door. Mother Superior Marguerite answered it to find a frantic German medical officer demanding access to the infirmary and requesting any nuns with medical training to assist immediately. Soldiers were falling ill by the dozens, he explained, with symptoms suggesting severe food contamination or possibly an epidemic of some kind. Sister Marie-Thérèse presented herself as available to help, following the medical officer across the courtyard to the monastery. What she found there was a scene of complete devastation. Soldiers lay on the floors of hallways and rooms, most too weak to make it to the latrines, many covered in their own vomit and waste. The few who were still on their feet were attempting to help their comrades, but were clearly struggling with their own symptoms. The German medical officer, a captain named Dietrich Weber, was completely overwhelmed. He had a staff of only 4 medical orderlies to care for 200 desperately ill men, and he himself was beginning to show signs of illness, having eaten the same meal. He grasped Sister Marie-Thérèse by the shoulders and asked her desperately if she had any idea what could have caused this. She looked him directly in the eye and said that it appeared to be severe food poisoning, possibly from contaminated meat or from a toxic plant that had accidentally been included in the vegetables. She recommended immediate hydration for all patients, induced vomiting for those who had not already emptied their stomachs, and transport to proper medical facilities for the most severe cases. Captain Weber nodded and began barking orders to his orderlies. Sister Marie-Thérèse moved through the crowded rooms with professional efficiency, assessing patients, providing comfort, and administering what treatments she could. She checked pulses, listened to breathing, looked for signs of the most dangerous complications. The sight and smell of the suffering around her was overwhelming, but she forced herself to maintain composure. These were the consequences of her choice, and she would not turn away from them. She would witness what she had done. She would tend to these men, even as she knew that she was responsible for their current state. Throughout the night, the situation worsened before it began to stabilize. Approximately 180 of the 200 soldiers were severely affected. The remaining 20 had either eaten less of the contaminated food or had naturally stronger constitutions. Several soldiers appeared to be in genuine medical danger, their dehydration and electrolyte imbalances severe enough to cause heart irregularities and altered consciousness. Sister Marie-Thérèse made sure these men received priority attention, working alongside Captain Weber to prepare intravenous fluids and arrange for their transport to the military hospital in Liège, some 35 kilometers away. The German military command responded with predictable fury and efficiency. By dawn on October 15th, senior officers had arrived from regional headquarters to investigate. The entire convent and monastery complex was sealed off. Every person who had been involved in food preparation was interrogated. Sister Marie-Thérèse sat calmly through 3 separate interviews, maintaining her story that she had used vegetables from the convent garden and preserved meat from the military supply stores. She suggested that perhaps the meat had been contaminated, or that a toxic plant had been misidentified and included in the garden harvest. She appeared shocked and deeply distressed that her cooking had caused such suffering, exactly the response one would expect from a nun whose vocation was healing. The German investigators were thorough but ultimately handicapped by their own assumptions. They tested the remaining food stores and found nothing obviously toxic, though Sister Marie-Thérèse had carefully disposed of the specific vegetables she had claimed to use. They interviewed the other sisters, all of whom confirmed that Sister Marie-Thérèse had indeed prepared the meal using garden produce. They searched the convent for evidence of sabotage materials or resistance connections, but found nothing, as Philippe's network had made sure to remove all incriminating evidence from the area days before the operation. And critically, they could not quite believe that a black nun, of all people, would have the knowledge, the means, or the audacity to deliberately poison 200 German soldiers. Their own prejudices made it easier to blame contaminated supplies or accidental poisoning than to see the truth that was standing right in front of them. The investigation concluded after 5 days with an official determination that the mass illness had been caused by botulism from improperly preserved meat in the military supply chain. Several supply officers were reprimanded and reassigned. The convent was released from quarantine, though the sisters were prohibited from preparing food for military personnel in the future. Sister Marie-Thérèse was questioned one final time by a Gestapo officer, who seemed more suspicious than the military investigators, but even he could find no concrete evidence of deliberate sabotage. He warned her that the German authorities would be watching the convent closely, and that any further incidents would be dealt with severely. She met his gaze steadily and assured him that she wanted nothing more than to return to her peaceful work of prayer and healing. The strategic impact of the operation was significant. The logistics unit was completely non-functional for 9 days, as soldiers gradually recovered and were returned to duty in stages. The deployment orders that had been scheduled for October 16th were delayed by 12 days, throwing off the carefully coordinated timing of the German counter-offensive. By the time the battalion was fully operational again, Allied intelligence had identified the planned operation and had repositioned forces to counter it. The offensive, when it finally launched, was significantly less successful than German commanders had anticipated and was ultimately abandoned after suffering heavy losses without achieving its territorial objectives. Sister Marie-Thérèse resumed her normal duties at the convent, working in the clinic and tending to the sick as she always had. But something fundamental had changed in her. She carried the weight of what she had done every day, seeing the faces of those soldiers in her mind, remembering Friedrich Hartmann's kind smile as he thanked her for the food she had poisoned. Mother Superior Marguerite kept her promise of support, spending long hours in conversation with her, helping her process the moral complexity of her actions. The other sisters never knew the truth, believing to their deaths that it had been a tragic accident. Philippe and the resistance network wanted her to undertake additional operations, but she refused. She had agreed to one specific mission because of its strategic importance and its calculated design to incapacitate rather than kill. She would not become a serial poisoner, would not allow herself to be used as a weapon again and again until the moral lines she had so carefully drawn became meaningless. She continued to provide intelligence and medical assistance to the resistance, but she would not cross that particular line a second time. Corbeau argued with her, pointing out her unique position and skills, but she was immovable. Some prices could only be paid once. The German military never did discover the truth about what had happened that night in October of 1943. Their reports attributed the incident to supply chain failures and the inherent risks of occupation duty in hostile territory. Sister Marie-Thérèse's role remained secret, known only to the small group of resistance leaders who had planned the operation with her, and to Mother Superior Marguerite. The soldiers who had been made ill were reassigned to various units across the occupied territories once they recovered. A few were eventually sent to the Eastern Front, where many did not survive. Friedrich Hartmann, the corporal who had been kind to her, was transferred to a unit in northern France and was captured by Allied forces during the Normandy invasion in June of 1944. He survived the conflict and returned to his family in Bavaria. Sister Marie-Thérèse remained in Namur throughout the rest of the occupation, continuing her work in the clinic and her more covert work with the resistance. When American forces liberated the city in September of 1944, she was among the civilians who lined the streets, not cheering exuberantly like many others, but standing quietly with tears streaming down her face, feeling the overwhelming relief of survival. The convent had made it through the conflict intact, though many in the town had not been so fortunate. The Jewish families were gone. Several young resistance fighters, including a man she had treated multiple times, had been captured and executed. The town bore the scars of 4 years of occupation in its damaged buildings, its depleted population, and in the haunted eyes of those who remained. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, there was a period of celebration and accounting. Resistance members were lauded as heroes. Collaborators were identified and punished. Sister Marie-Thérèse found herself in an uncomfortable position. Philippe and others wanted to tell her story, to celebrate her operation as a brilliant act of resistance. She forbade it absolutely. She did not want to be celebrated for poisoning people, even if they had been enemy soldiers. She did not want her name associated with that action, and she did not want to face the complicated questions that would inevitably arise about whether what she had done was heroic or criminal, justified or excessive. So the story remained secret, known only to those who had been directly involved. The Catholic Church itself was grappling with its role during the occupation, with some clergy having actively resisted, while others had chosen accommodation or even collaboration. Sister Marie-Thérèse represented a complicated case that did not fit neatly into any category. Mother Superior Marguerite eventually wrote a confidential report to their order's leadership, explaining what had happened and seeking guidance on how to understand Sister Marie-Thérèse's actions within the context of Catholic moral theology. The response, when it came months later, was nuanced. The Church acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances of war and occupation and recognized that individuals faced impossible choices that could not be judged by peacetime standards. Sister Marie-Thérèse's actions, while troubling, appeared to have been undertaken with proper moral deliberation, with the goal of preventing greater harm and without exceeding what was strategically necessary. She would not be condemned, but neither would she be celebrated. She should be supported in her ongoing spiritual journey and her work of healing. In 1946, Sister Marie-Thérèse requested a transfer back to the Belgian Congo, wanting to return to the mission hospital where she had begun her religious life. Mother Superior Marguerite supported the request, understanding that Sister Marie-Thérèse needed distance from Namur and from the memories of what had happened there. The transfer was approved, and Sister Marie-Thérèse sailed from Antwerp in July of that year, watching the coastline of Belgium disappear with mixed feelings of relief and sorrow. She had given 4 years of her life to that country during its darkest period, and she carried the weight of one terrible night that had helped to change the course of events in ways that few would ever know. She spent the next 23 years working in mission hospitals throughout the Congo, training local medical staff, treating patients, and gradually finding a measure of peace. The colony achieved independence in 1960, a process that brought its own violence and upheaval. Sister Marie-Thérèse navigated this transition with the same pragmatic wisdom she had developed during the European conflict, understanding that independence was necessary even when it was messy, that freedom was worth the cost of uncertainty. She worked with the new Congolese government to establish medical training programs and to expand healthcare access to rural areas. Her reputation as a healer grew, and she became a respected elder in the medical community, known for her skill, her dedication, and the gentle strength with which she carried herself. She never married, never had children, never returned to Belgium. She wrote occasional letters to Mother Superior Marguerite until the older woman's passing in 1957, and maintained sporadic contact with a few of the sisters from the convent of the Sacred Heart. But she did not speak about the occupation years, did not tell stories about the resistance, and never revealed her role in the October operation. When younger nuns asked her about her experiences during the European conflict, she would say only that those had been difficult times that taught her much about human nature, both its capacity for cruelty and its capacity for courage. She deflected requests for details, saying that dwelling on the past served no useful purpose when there was so much work to be done in the present. In 1968, at age 60, Sister Marie-Thérèse was diagnosed with heart disease. The diagnosis was not unexpected, as she had pushed herself relentlessly for decades, often working 12-hour days in the hospital and taking on the most difficult cases that others preferred to avoid. She accepted the news with characteristic calm, making arrangements for her eventual passing and ensuring that her work would be continued by the younger medical staff she had trained. She died on March 3, 1969, in the mission hospital in Kinshasa, surrounded by colleagues who had become family, with a rosary in her hands and a prayer on her lips. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched through her medical work. The homily, delivered by a Congolese priest who had known her for 20 years, spoke of her dedication to healing, her compassion for the suffering, and her unwavering faith. There was no mention of Belgium, of the occupation, or of one night in October when she had made an impossible choice that haunted her for the rest of her life. That story remained locked away, known only to the few who had shared it with her. It was not until 1987, nearly 2 decades after her passing, that the truth about Sister Marie-Thérèse's operation began to emerge. Philippe Durand, who had been her primary resistance contact and who had kept her secret faithfully for 4 decades, was dying of cancer in a Brussels hospital. As he prepared to meet his own end, he decided that certain stories needed to be told before the last people who remembered them were gone. He gave an interview to a Belgian historian who was documenting resistance activities during the occupation, and in that interview, he finally revealed Sister Marie-Thérèse's role in the October operation. The revelation caused a minor sensation in Belgium. Newspapers ran articles about the black nun who had poisoned 200 German soldiers. Some celebrated her as a hero of the resistance. Others questioned the ethics of using poison, even against military targets during wartime. Catholic theologians debated whether her actions could be reconciled with the Church's teachings on the sanctity of life and the principles of just war theory. Medical ethicists discussed the violation of the healer's role that her operation represented, using her case as an example in discussions about the boundaries of medical ethics during armed conflict. But Sister Marie-Thérèse herself was not present to participate in these debates. She had been dead for 18 years and could not defend her choices or provide context for her actions. All that remained were the basic facts of what had happened, Philippe's recollections of her careful moral deliberation, and the documented strategic impact of the operation. Historians attempting to reconstruct her story found frustratingly little primary source material. She had left no diary, no memoir, no personal papers that shed light on her internal experience. The letters she had written to Mother Superior Marguerite had been destroyed per the older nun's will. The resistance records that mentioned her were sparse and used only her code name, Hibiscus, without providing personal details. What did emerge from the historical investigation was a fuller picture of just how unusual her position had been. As a black woman in occupied Belgium, she had occupied a space of profound marginality. The German occupation forces had very specific racial hierarchies that classified different populations according to their supposed value and threat level. Africans and people of African descent were generally regarded with a mixture of curiosity, disdain, and confusion, not fitting neatly into the categories the German military used to organize the populations they controlled. This marginal status had made Sister Marie-Thérèse functionally invisible in many situations, able to move through spaces and hear conversations that would have been guarded more carefully if she had been a white Belgian woman. Her religious vocation had provided additional protection and access. Nuns were generally treated with a degree of respect by German forces, seen as harmless, and primarily concerned with spiritual matters rather than politics. The combination of being a nun and being black had created a kind of double invisibility. She was simultaneously exotic enough to be noticed, and yet so far outside the categories of people the German military considered threatening that she was largely dismissed as irrelevant. This had been her greatest strategic advantage, and she had exploited it brilliantly. The historical research also revealed that Sister Marie-Thérèse's operation had not been an isolated incident. Throughout occupied Europe, women religious had been involved in resistance activities ranging from hiding refugees to gathering intelligence to active sabotage. Convents had served as safe houses, as message drops, as medical facilities for resistance fighters, and as centers of quiet defiance against occupation authorities. Many nuns had paid with their lives for these activities. Sister Marie-Thérèse's operation was unusual primarily in its scale and in its use of pharmaceutical knowledge to achieve strategic military objectives. But the underlying pattern of religious women resisting occupation was well documented. The moral question of whether her actions were justified remained contested. Some historians and ethicists argued that she had violated fundamental principles of medical ethics and religious vocation by deliberately using her healing knowledge to harm. They contended that poisoning, even of enemy soldiers, represented a form of treachery that undermined the laws of war and basic human decency. Others argued that she had operated within the bounds of legitimate resistance activity, targeting military personnel in a manner that was actually more humane than conventional combat, as her goal had been temporary incapacitation rather than death, and she had carefully calibrated dosages to minimize the risk of fatalities. The soldiers who had been affected by the operation, those few who were still alive in the late 1980s when the story emerged, had mixed reactions. Friedrich Hartmann, the corporal who had been kind to Sister Marie-Thérèse, was interviewed by a journalist and expressed a complicated mixture of emotions. He said that learning the truth about what had happened had been shocking and disturbing, forcing him to reconsider memories he had carried for 45 years. He had thought of the food poisoning as a random misfortune, one of the many difficulties of military service during the conflict. Learning that it had been deliberate, that the kind nun who had served him had been responsible, created a cognitive dissonance that was difficult to resolve. Yet he also acknowledged that he had been part of an occupying force, that his unit had been engaged in military operations that contributed to the continuation of the conflict, and that resistance was a natural and legitimate response to occupation. He did not know, he admitted, whether he could forgive Sister Marie-Thérèse for what she had done, but he could understand it. The Belgian government eventually erected a small memorial plaque in Namur, honoring Sister Marie-Thérèse Beaumont and other resistance members who had operated from the city. The plaque did not specify the exact nature of her operation, referring only to her courage and sacrifice in service of Belgian liberation. The Convent of the Sacred Heart, which had been converted into a community center in the 1970s following the decline in religious vocations, hosted a ceremony on the 50th anniversary of the October operation, inviting historians and former resistance members to discuss the moral complexity of resistance activities during the occupation. The event was respectful but not celebratory, acknowledging that the acts of ordinary people during extraordinary times often defied simple moral categorization. Sister Marie-Thérèse's story has since become a case study in multiple academic disciplines. Medical ethicists use it to explore the boundaries of the physician's duty to do no harm, particularly in contexts of armed conflict where normal moral frameworks are disrupted. Historians of resistance movements examine it as an example of how marginalized individuals could leverage their marginal status for strategic purposes. Scholars of race and colonialism analyze how her identity as a black woman shaped both her vulnerability and her effectiveness as a resistance operative. Theologians continue to debate whether her actions can be reconciled with Catholic teachings on violence and the sanctity of life. What remains clear across all these analyses is that Sister Marie-Thérèse Beaumont was a person of remarkable complexity. She was deeply religious and genuinely committed to her vocation of healing, yet she was capable of making brutally pragmatic decisions when she believed the circumstances demanded them. She was gentle and compassionate in her daily interactions, yet she possessed a core of steel that allowed her to take actions that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She was marginalized by both her race and her gender, Yet she found ways to transform those markers of marginalization into sources of power and agency. She lived a life of service and devotion, yet she crossed moral lines that many of her religious colleagues would never have considered crossing. The question of whether she was right to do what she did may never be satisfactorily answered. It depends on one's framework for evaluating ethical behavior in extreme circumstances, on one's views about the legitimacy of resistance to occupation, on one's understanding of proportionality in the use of force, and on dozens of other contested philosophical and theological questions. What cannot be disputed is that she made a choice, that she did so with full awareness of its implications, and that she carried the weight of that choice for the rest of her life without seeking exoneration or celebration. Her story also raises profound questions about whose stories get told and how they get told. For more than 4 decades after the end of the European conflict, Sister Marie-Thérèse's role in the resistance was unknown outside a tiny circle of former resistance members. She herself had actively prevented the story from being told, refusing the recognition that others thought she deserved. When the story did finally emerge, it came not from her own voice, but from the recollections of others, interpreted through the lenses of historians and journalists who had never met her and could not access her interior experience. We can reconstruct the external facts of what she did, but we can only speculate about what it meant to her, how she understood her own actions, and how she reconciled them with her faith and her vocation. The few people who knew her personally and who outlived her long enough to comment on the revelations about her resistance work all emphasized certain qualities. They spoke of her quietness, her tendency to listen more than she spoke. They mentioned her absolute reliability, the sense that if Sister Marie-Thérèse committed to doing something, it would be done exactly as promised. They recalled her particular attentiveness to people who were suffering, and the way she seemed to carry other people's pain as if it were her own. And several people noted that she had a habit of pausing before answering questions, as if carefully considering not just what she would say, but whether she should say it at all. These personality traits, which might seem unremarkable in ordinary circumstances, take on additional significance when understood as characteristics of someone who had lived with a profound secret for decades. The impact of her operation extended beyond its immediate strategic effects. The incident contributed to a broader pattern of uncertainty and paranoia within German occupation forces about the reliability of food supplies and the trustworthiness of local populations. Reports from other occupied territories show that the Namur poisoning was cited as a cautionary example in briefings about security procedures and food handling protocols. German military kitchens throughout Belgium and northern France implemented stricter oversight of meal preparation, banned local civilian involvement in military food service, and increased testing of food supplies for contamination. These measures diverted resources and personnel that could have been used for other purposes, creating a small but real additional burden on the occupation apparatus. The operation also had psychological effects that rippled through both the resistance networks and the occupation forces. For the resistance, it demonstrated that creative approaches to disrupting German operations could be effective, even when conventional military action was impossible. It showed that people in seemingly marginal positions, like religious women, could wield significant power when they acted with intelligence and determination. Several resistance cells in other regions attempted similar operations targeting military food supplies, though none achieved the scale or precision of Sister Marie-Thérèse's work, and several resulted in detection and brutal reprisals against local populations. For the German forces, the incident reinforced a sense of vulnerability that was corrosive to morale. Soldiers occupying hostile territory always faced the tension between maintaining vigilance and trying to establish some semblance of normal routine. The poisoning destroyed the illusion of safety that the logistics unit in Namur had enjoyed. Even after the official investigation concluded and the incident was attributed to accidental contamination, many soldiers remained suspicious of locally prepared food, of civilian workers in German facilities, and of the apparent cooperation of the occupied population. This low-level anxiety was exactly the effect that resistance activities aim to create, making the occupation more costly and difficult to sustain. The story of Sister Marie-Thérèse also illuminates the particular challenges and opportunities faced by people of African descent in occupied Europe. The German occupation forces were implementing racial policies that were primarily focused on Jewish populations and on the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, who were targeted for enslavement and eventual elimination, according to the racist ideology of the German state. Africans and people of African descent occupied an ambiguous position in this racial hierarchy. They were certainly considered inferior by German racial theorists, but they were not the primary targets of genocidal violence in the way that Jewish and Slavic populations were. This created a space of relative, though far from complete, safety that some people of African descent were able to navigate strategically. Sister Marie-Thérèse's navigation of this space was masterful precisely because it played on the assumptions and prejudices of the people around her. To the German forces, she was exotic and therefore incomprehensible, a curiosity rather than a threat. To many Belgians, including some in the resistance, she was marginal and therefore easily overlooked, someone whose capabilities and agency were underestimated because of her race. She used both sets of assumptions to her advantage, allowing herself to be seen as less capable and less significant than she actually was, thereby gaining access and freedom of movement that a white Belgian woman in her position might not have had. This strategic use of marginality is a recurring theme in the histories of people who have been systematically oppressed. When direct confrontation is impossible or suicidal, survival and resistance often require finding ways to work within and around the systems of power that seek to control or eliminate you. Sister Marie-Thérèse's life exemplified this approach. She had learned in the Belgian Congo how to navigate colonial systems that defined her as lesser. She brought that knowledge with her to Belgium and applied it during the occupation, understanding that invisibility could be a weapon and that being underestimated created opportunities. The religious dimension of her story adds another layer of complexity. Catholic religious orders have a long history of providing spaces where women could exercise authority, education, and professional expertise that was largely denied to them in secular society. Becoming a nun offered paths to education, medical training, and international travel that would have been impossible for most women of Sister Marie-Thérèse's generation and background. The convent was one of the few institutions in the 1930s and 40s where a black woman could gain advanced medical knowledge and practice it professionally. This institutional support was crucial to her ability to conduct the October operation. Without her position in the convent, without the trust and protection of Mother Superior Marguerite, without the medical knowledge she had gained through religious institutional channels, she would not have been positioned to take the actions she took. Yet the religious framework also created profound moral tensions. The Catholic tradition has complex and sometimes contradictory teachings about violence, resistance to evil, and the sanctity of life. Sister Marie-Thérèse was operating within a tradition that included both the absolute prohibition against killing, found in the Ten Commandments, and the tradition of just war theory that recognized circumstances where violence might be morally permissible or even obligatory. She was part of an institution that preached mercy and forgiveness, while also recognizing the reality of evil and the necessity of opposing it. These tensions were not abstract theological questions for her, but lived dilemmas that she had to navigate with real consequences. Her solution, insofar as we can reconstruct it from the limited available evidence, was to draw very careful boundaries around what she was willing to do. She would not participate directly in combat or in operations designed to kill. She would not become a habitual saboteur or resistance operative. She would undertake one specific operation, carefully planned to minimize permanent harm, serving a clear strategic purpose, and then she would return to her primary vocation of healing. This boundary drawing suggests someone engaged in genuine moral reasoning, rather than simply justifying whatever actions seemed expedient. She was trying to act ethically within an inherently unethical situation, and she recognized that this was a fundamentally impossible task that required compromise and would leave moral residue regardless of what choice she made. The aftermath of her operation, the years of silence and service that followed, suggest that she understood and accepted the weight of what she had done. She did not attempt to minimize it, did not claim that the ends justified the means, did not seek praise or recognition. She simply carried it as part of who she was and continued her work of trying to heal and help where she could. This is perhaps the most profound aspect of her story, not the dramatic act itself, but the quiet integrity with which she lived with the consequences of that act for 25 years afterward. In the decades since her story became public, Sister Marie-Thérèse has been claimed by various groups as a symbol of their own causes and values. Anti-colonial activists have highlighted her story as an example of African resistance to European domination, noting that she fought against German occupation of Belgium, even as Belgium maintained its own brutal colonial rule over the Congo. Feminist historians have celebrated her as an example of women's hidden roles in military resistance, showing how women in non-combat positions could still have strategic impact. Catholic progressives have pointed to her as evidence that the Church has a tradition of resistance to tyranny and injustice, even when that resistance requires actions that challenge conventional moral teachings. Each of these appropriations captures something real about her story, but also risks flattening the complexity of who she actually was. Sister Marie-Thérèse was not primarily a political activist or a symbol. She was a particular individual facing particular circumstances, trying to make choices that aligned with her values and her understanding of what was right, knowing that all available choices were deeply flawed. She did not set out to be a hero or a symbol. She set out to stop a military operation that she believed would cause significant harm, and she used the tools and knowledge available to her to achieve that goal. Everything else, the fame, the controversy, the symbolic appropriations, came after, imposed on her story by others. The question remains, what should we make of Sister Marie-Thérèse Beaumont? How should we understand and evaluate her choices? There is no single answer that will satisfy everyone. Those who prioritize absolute moral rules about the use of violence and the duty of medical professionals to heal rather than harm will likely conclude that she crossed a line that should never be crossed, regardless of the circumstances. Those who embrace a more consequentialist framework, evaluating actions based on their outcomes, will likely conclude that she made a difficult but justified choice that prevented greater harm. Those who emphasize the importance of resistance to occupation and the legitimacy of using whatever means are available will likely celebrate her as a hero who did what was necessary. Perhaps the most honest answer is that Sister Marie-Thérèse's story does not resolve into a neat moral lesson. It instead confronts us with the messy reality of moral decision-making in extreme circumstances, where all available options involve some form of wrongdoing, where the principles we hold in ordinary times cannot be straightforwardly applied, where good people must do terrible things or allow even more terrible things to happen. Her story is valuable not because it provides clear answers, but because it forces us to grapple with genuinely difficult moral questions without the comfort of obvious right answers. What is certain is that Sister Marie-Thérèse Beaumont was a person of extraordinary courage, intelligence, and moral seriousness. She lived a life dedicated to service and healing. She made one dramatic choice that violated the normal rules of her vocation because she believed, after careful consideration, that the alternative was worse. She carried the weight of that choice for the rest of her life without seeking to escape responsibility for it. And she continued, day after day, year after year, to heal and to serve, to be present to suffering, to embody in her daily life the compassion and dedication that defined her vocation. That combination of moral complexity and quiet integrity makes her story worth remembering and worth wrestling with, not as a simple tale of heroism, but as a profound exploration of what it means to try to act ethically when ethics itself is under siege. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.